Right then, shall I begin?
Good evening. This is Neil Crumpton. He will introduce himself.
Hi. Okay, well, thanks for the invite. Basically, I'm an ex-Friends of the Earth energy campaigner. I worked for Friends of the Earth for about 16 years as a staff member. I was a supporter of 33 years before that, so I've long been working in the campaigning world. I've got a degree in electrical engineering, and my specialism is energy and transport policy. I was based in Wales, but I also worked for London. I worked with Friends of the Earth till 2010, and I became their nuclear campaigner in about 2005. After that, I joined the Bologna Foundation, which is a Norwegian NGO, very similar to Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, but operating from Norway and mainland Europe. Currently, I'm an independent consultant. Don't get much work, paid work that is, but I do. I am on the DEC NGO Nuclear Forum and the ONR, that's the Office of Nuclear Regulation NGO Forum, both unpaid positions, so I give free scrutiny to Britain's nuclear energy and radioactive waste policy. And Sue is on the INR forum as well, and Nikki, one of your members, is on the DEC NGO forum.
Well, but we go to both actually.
Yeah, you do, of course. Yeah. So basically, I spend a lot of my spare time campaigning against nuclear power. My speciality, I would say, is on energy scenarios to 2050 and beyond, and energy technologies, and how to build energy systems. So I was at a meeting a few weeks ago with Joe in London, and I said a few things that Joe and Alan suggested that I might want to share with this group. So it's about a report called Nuclear Pathways, a Nuclear Pathways report, and what it might mean. So here we go. I work for, I'm chair and co-founder of an NGO, a not-for-profit company and charity called Planet Hydrogen. It's pretty dormant at the moment. My co-founder is getting on and a bit ill, so we are still a going concern, but we don't do all that much that's very high profile. Okay, so anyway, the first thing I do in any nuclear talk is try to put nuclear power in perspective in both the kind of global and local or UK level. Globally, nuclear supplies about 2.6% of global energy use. That's 2.6%, and with global energy use rising, probably doubling in the next 45 years or so, with 9+ billion people, that's probably going to fall to 1.3% at current levels of nuclear output. You won't really see those figures anywhere in the press, because you're usually given the perspective of nuclear in electricity, not in energy. And when you look at it in energy, it's hardly a climate solution at those kind of levels. The Red Book, so we just started. So
Right,
okay.
It's only just
There's what's called the Red Book, Uranium Resources, global resources of uranium, are about 5.3 to 13 million tonnes, depending on how you count it. That could meet current supply for about 1.3% of future energy for about 190 years, or if you use it faster, 2.6 for 85 years. So again, that's hardly a climate solution. The World Nuclear Association, WNA, estimate 4% by 2050, presumably if what's called fast or breeder reactors are proven by around 2035. These can reuse waste to make plutonium to put in new reactors. Those are fast breeder reactors. There's been one at Dunray and in various other countries over the past few decades. with varying degrees of success or failure, mainly failure. Anyway, there's also thorium. That is another kind of fissile material. You could scale up thorium reactors in the kind of light water reactors that would be built at Hinkley C. But it's a question of if and when. And the Indians and Chinese are doing some work on thorium light water reactors. And then there's renewables, and in context, they can last several billion years. So that's the context of the energy sources. In the UK, nuclear reactors have averaged around 3.6 of UK energy demand. That's in the last, say, 10 or 20 years. That's the average. It's sometimes below that, sometimes higher, but it's about 18% of electricity. You'll always see the figure of electricity used in nuclear press releases, and the media always tends to get it wrong. They say, oh, that's providing 18% of nuclear, of UK energy. So they suddenly bump it up by 5 times, and it's remarkable how often that's done by journalists just making that simple error. Anyway, a replacement, and I put 16 gigawatts, actually it's about more like 11 gigawatts, but a replacement programme would supply about 8% of 2050 UK energy. That's because, in theory, with good energy efficiency, UK energy use will fall, and with that extra nuclear, that balance would go from 3.6 it is now, possibly up to around 8. I'll put some figures in TWH, terawatt hours a year, for those of you who wish to look at the slides and maybe check out the figures that I'm using later. A replacement nuclear programme was subject to a public consultation in 2006-07 and a reconsultation in 2007, as the first consultation was judged misleading, flawed and procedurally unfair. Greenpeace brought an action against the then, BER, as it was, the civil servants. I was on that second consultation as part of the stakeholder group that was basically pre-consulted before the main consultation, if you see what I mean. So again, the NGOs generally pulled out of that pre-consultation on the basis that the civil service weren't playing fair with us, and they were going to ask the public various questions and do things in their own way that we thought isn't an open way of doing consultation. Anyway, that consultation was duly taken. The view spun by government at the time was that it was generally in favour of, the public were generally in favour of new nuclear, with certain caveats based on waste and how well renewables did. Despite that, New Labour very much pushed nuclear forward, and indeed the coalition, when it came in 2010 at time, Secretary of State Hoon justified the new nuclear reactors, and essentially that becomes a nuclear programme. So he justified a new nuclear programme. The word justified is a legal term based on a requirement to fulfil a test that the benefits of new nuclear ionising radiation facilities or use has to outweigh the health detriments that it may cause. So, so that's what's happened to in 2010. Secretary of State Hoon moved on not long after that. Then all went quiet. The nuclear PR was doing its thing, I suppose, and you've all been involved in that, I'm sure. Then in 2013, in statements by ministers and a self-styled ad hoc group of chief civil servants, there was about 4 of them, including David Mackay of DEC and the government's chief scientist at the time, Bedlington, made it clear that they wanted more nuclear. They were very interested in these new types of nuclear technology, and the Her Majesty's government brought out a nuclear pathways report in, I think, December of last year. It made it clear that the 16 gigawatt replacement programme was now just to be considered as a first tranche, and that up to 55 gigawatts and possibly 75 gigawatts was being considered and was detailed in that report. Up to, I'm not saying that there would, that was the only choice that there, but anything up to those kind of figures. The 20 gigawatts between 55 and 75 could be the light water reactors or fast reactors, the fast breeder reactors, should they be proven. So they were looking at some very large nuclear expansion, shall we say. And just to put that in context, 55 gigawatts would supply nearly 30% of UK energy. That's by 2050-ish. And 75 gigawatts would supply getting on towards 40% of UK energy, depending on what future energy might be, but it's that kind of area. Few people or the media noticed this. It came out in December, so I guess most people were buying presents and things. The media didn't really pick up on it either, but there it was. And so I, for one, was basically saying, should the public not question such a significant escalation in nuclear energy? And so that's what I've been doing for the last 12 months or so. Just to go back, in 2007 there was a broad consensus that the UK needs sustainable energy. That's affordable, low carbon, secure. Everybody tended to sign up to that. The runners and riders were energy efficiency, that being insulation, appliances or whatever, combined heat and power and district heating. Denmark is 50% of their electricity is district heating. In Britain it's about 7%, and most of that is industrial. So that we have plenty of scope there for efficient use of fuels. And renewable energies. I say energies because it's not just one energy, it's 7 different, very different types of energy. And it can be mixed together. So that's an important point. Then there's the Generation 3 and Generation 4 nuclear technologies. That's the light water reactors a la Hinkley C and possible fast breeder reactors that they might test within the next 5, 10, 15 years. And then there's carbon capture and storage on gas and coal, power stations that is, or indeed CCS on industrial emitters or biomass with CCS. So those are the various technologies that were on the radar at that time. The consultation suggested a replacement was, well, it was 11 gigawatts because that's about how much we have, but it morphed into 16 gigawatts. And that in itself was an escalation from about 80 to 120. So that was a 50% increase in what replacement actually meant. CCS was considered unproven despite a full chain scheme working in Dakota since 2000. Our chief scientist didn't actually know that. And indeed that the EPR reactor type, or the AP1000, were and still are unproven. And the advanced boiling water reactor has been built but doesn't work very well. So you could argue that that isn't exactly proven either. Despite this, in October, again, Secretary of State Hume justified new nuclear, benefits outweigh the health risks, basically saying that it's much lower estimated cost than renewables, less gas from Russia, forgetting that the UK gets most of its gas from Norway and will do so for a while yet, and was building LNG terminals, liquefied natural gas terminals. So we're getting a lot of our gas now from Kuwait and get it from other areas as well. And then obviously they were mentioning security of supply, that nuclear provides baseload generation. Cameron used the word baseload quite a lot. And that uranium storable, so we could, even if there was a conflict, we could store 4 years or so of uranium without much trouble. So since 2010, the government has been drawing up a policy of electricity market reform in an energy bill which received royal assent in December. And by 2013, the Committee on Climate Change, that Friends of the Earth was very much part of bringing into existence to kind of be a watchdog over the government's of the day's climate policies, was recommending that the electricity sector be decarbonised, and they were putting caps on CO2 from the power generation. And so, so just to try and put it in a bit of context, that last year I was asked, I persuaded the Minister of the day, John Hayes, that on the Nuclear Forum, that we submit a non-nuclear energy scenario for him to hear out before he makes his, he thought he was going to be there for a while, and so he agreed to that, amazingly. So I put forward an energy scenario and a nuclear one and a non-nuclear one to draw out the comparisons, and this is a kind of summary. And basically, if you look at the 2012 column, it's what we are now in terms of this is electricity, by the way. That nuclear is providing about 18%, renewables is about, I think, 5%. And mainly coal and gas. Then by 2020, the renewables obviously jump to just over 100 there on that graph. The colours are better there, the light blue. Biomass, that could be Drax or others, or indeed anaerobic digestion. All those different types of biomass are another small part. And then the rest is coal and gas. Mainly gas. And then by 2030, this is based on what I was suggesting as certainly as a good jump in renewables of mainly offshore wind and PV, more biomass. Then there's Sizewell, which would still be operating in 2030 and beyond, and that just shows you how much of the last column shows you how much offshore wind there would be. The dark blue is offshore wind to 2020, and the purplish colour is the offshore wind built in the 2020s. So offshore wind would be a big part of any renewables expansion, along with PV, which is coming up quite well now. So that's a non-nuclear scenario. So you can compare it with a nuclear scenario, and that's, you see in the 2030 column, that big red part at the top compresses all the other things, so there'd be less renewables. You can't afford to have both. So by introducing nuclear, you're displacing renewables, and you're displacing some gas. Not all that much in the wider aspect, but that shows you what it does. You can see what it does to offshore wind. You see the white line and the compression of offshore wind. That really does damage our offshore wind industry. And coming from Hull, which has now been granted, well, the Siemens factory is coming to Hull. That's employment in Hull going down the pan there. You may get to more at Sheffield Forgemasters and Rolls-Royce, but I think the net balance is that it would damage British jobs in favour of French and Japanese ones. This is a slightly more complicated one, but it basically, I was arguing, certainly with Friends of the Earth, that if renewables couldn't do the necessary, which DEC was arguing, that you could use CCS. It didn't have to all to be renewables, because they were accepting that CCS they would be doing it themselves anyway. So, so it depends on the emission cap. So if you wanted to get to 50 grams per kilowatt hour for your power stations, that's there. One could argue that if you're really reducing your electricity demand 340, you're well below the cap, even with a non-nuclear scenario. With a nuclear scenario, you're doing even better because you've got less gas. If you're at 390, if your electricity use is increasing, which DEC and others have saying would happen, then you're still just below the 50 grams cap with nuclear, but this is where the extra gas would take a non-nuclear scenario over. But your CCS potential by 2030, and this is the government's own figures, is for that kind of purpley pinky line there. So you're well within adding in a bit of CCS if you don't think renewables can do it. So the government don't really have a case to say that nuclear is crucial. Yet usually ministers say that nuclear is crucial in all their press releases. Crucial, to my mind, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary of crucial, it doesn't mean it's, it means it has to be in there, and that's it's just not true. Anyway, right, what that says there is the pathways report, and then uranium. Let's look at it in terms of uranium, this big expansion of nuclear power. Essentially, the pathway report contemplates a significant escalation of nuclear power in the UK 3.5 to 4.7 times that 16 gigawatt tranche that we were all publicly consulted on. So that's 3 to 5 times more. That's, as I said, 30 to 40% energy dependence on nuclear power. So in terms of national security, that's 30-40% dependence on uranium imports from wherever. Australia is obviously going to be one, Canada is obviously going to be one.
Kazakhstan.
Maybe not nowadays, who knows?
Africa.
So yeah, Niger, there's issues in Niger which involved British troops a year or two ago. So in terms of the Red Book resources, there's maybe 7 million tonnes to twice the price. Then you could possibly find another 7 million or 6 or 7 million tonnes if you go into different types of material. But if you look at it in a global equal share, and Britain basically said, led the world in nuclear revival, renaissance, and everybody else copied us, then we would be trying to extract 11 times more uranium than would be in our fair share. So who's going to go without, when they ask? And what if they didn't want to go without? It gets to, push comes to shove in terms of who gets the uranium. Russia and Kazakhstan and other states might be in their own little sphere by then. And if you do find a lot more, your equal share is still 5 times. So in terms of energy security, I would question that uranium availability in this pathways report. Looking at it in waste terms, it's unclear how much legacy waste we've got at the moment, but it's somewhere around, in terms of its radioactive content, about 87 million terabecquerels, which is disintegrations per second. That legacy waste is from all the previous reactors, plus some from the military. Yeah. So that has to be sorted, and that would have taken a repository with a footprint the size of GDF, that's a geologically disposal facility, with a footprint of maybe 3 to 4 kilometres square. If you have a 16 gigawatt programme, then you could be producing up to 244 million terabecquerels. And that's high burn-up waste. That's more thermally hotter and more radioactively hotter. And that could require a footprint of 11 to 16 kilometres squared. Then if you jump to 55 gigawatts, you just multiply those numbers up, and you could be over 800 million terabecquerels, and that would require a considerably larger footprint. One could argue that it's 9 to 13 legacy scale GDFs of the one that we're thinking of building at Sellafield. Now they're saying they would say that basically the one at Sellafield would contain both legacy and new build wastes, but they're not doing too well on that, because the geology is fractured and wet. Now you might be able to engineer your way out of some of that, but not if the public oppose you, which is what they did in Cumbria. So the one proposed GDF near Sellafield was rejected by the public participatory process, which has derailed the coalition plans. And remember, the part of the nuclear subsidies debate is that the operators would pay a fixed share of the waste costs, and that was a legacy waste GDF. So if you have to build more of them, then those costs would go up, but the fixed cost to the operator wouldn't. So that's arguably unfair state aid. And I hope somebody made that point to the European Commission recently. Anyway, so what would a 55 gigawatt, let's assume that you can't build 75 or it's unlikely by 2050. 55 gigawatts, what would it look like in terms of light water reactors built around Britain? It would require 11 to 17 coastal sites, 3 to 5 gigawatts each, easy to do the numbers. Not in Scotland unless things change around very rapidly. You need coastal sites because of the cooling water. You can't really build 5 gigawatts on rivers without causing a few problems, as the French found out. Each site's interim store, where a lot of the waste would be placed until it was cool enough to put in a repository, might reach something between 50 and possibly even up to 90 if you've got a 5 gigawatt cluster of the legacy waste stored at Sellafield. So Hinkley C, if these calculations are basically correct or thereabouts, and I'd like government to say what they see, would be storing an enormous amount of of radioactive waste in comparison with the legacy waste that we all think is going to be off somewhere in Cumbria or somewhere else. And that could be around for quite a while, 100 years, or certainly decades before we find a GDF or before it's cooled down. But the fast reactor enthusiasts like George Monbiot and Mark Linus for two say that these fast reactors could burn the waste, so you probably want to put them on the same site. So you might have a Hinkley C and a fast reactor Hinkley D, and the fast reactors need the waste to make plutonium to put in more fast reactors. So they need the waste from the light water reactors so it all gets going, as it were. So again, you need to consider that in terms of the rollout. A Hinkley C might be a Hinkley D and all the rest of it. The government should also say what the fast waste, there's waste coming out of the fast reactors, you should know what that waste consists of. Might only last 300 years, but it might be emitting a lot of radiation in that time. So you can spread your radiation out over 300,000 years or compress it higher into a shorter timescale. Yes, there may be less overall, but it still produces management issues in the meantime. So, let's go on. But the government could turn around and say, well, actually, we're building different types of reactors. They self-cool themselves, so they've got none of these accident problems of the light water reactors. They're small, 50 to 300 megawatt scale, and so we can build them inland, preferably on brownfield sites, industry sites, all the rest of it, and we could spread them around Britain. And so, let's say that say you have a 30 gigawatt deployment of small modular reactors. That could comprise anything from 100 to 600, they're generally buried in the ground, buried units dotted around the edge of cities, industry sites and refinery sites and potentially, well, probably rural areas as well. But that's the kind of reactor that James Lovelock tends to, a reactor in every back garden. That's the kind of thing he was talking about. So that's a different type of deployment. And all these reactors will be linked by occasional but routine, presumably armed fuel and waste removal convoys to interim stores and GDFs. So you can imagine. So I for one say, should there not be at least a public consultation on such a possible nuclear escalation? Should there not be a re-justification about such a possible nuclear escalation? And I put it in context that Secretary of State Ed Davey said that recently as the Glasgow Lib Dem conference that I attended in September, that new nuclear would produce far less waste. And basically he's fallen for the old volume, not radioactivity trick. I call it a trick because it was a crafty, whoever wrote that was very crafty. It's from a quorum report that says that radioactivity is this much, but the volume is very much more because reprocessing has caused a lot more intermediate and low-level waste. So in terms of volume, it's huge. And Blair announced that in the Commons that these new reactors produce far less waste. And Davey has said it 7 years later, despite being told by myself, and despite me telling Baroness Verma, and despite me telling Chief Scientist David Mackay that he's got it massively wrong, and yet he's consenting. So, Hinkley C. Anyway, Davey says that he's read all the detailed analysis by these civil servants, and so I just want to give you a couple of alternatives, shall we say. Offshore wind. One could argue that by 2020, all the bulk of the onshore wind that Britain will probably get will have been built. Cameron said that he'll stop nuclear build by 2020. Well, I think there was a view that we'd be kind of beginning to reach some kind of saturation by then anyway. So the big resource is offshore wind, as well as PV and a few other things. So the main thing that nuclear would displace is offshore wind, in my view. PV as well, but certainly offshore wind, and certainly up to 2030. And yet, in offshore wind development, it's only just starting out. There's fixed and floating structures. The resource is greater than UK energy, as it happens. It's British technology. We've got plenty of, although Siemens is, they're coming to Hull. There's plenty of British technology potential in there, and that means exports as well. The cost estimates for offshore wind by Dawn, one of the major players, are for less than £100 per megawatt hour by 2023, which would be the time when Hinkley C would be opening. So you're paying £90 per megawatt hour. It doesn't quite work like that because it's a strike price, but essentially the levelised cost of energy between nuclear and offshore wind in 2023 and towards 2030 is beginning to converge in basically in most people's estimates. So a 55 gigawatt nuclear programme, if you tried to do that in wind, you'd be using an area of the UK continental shelf sea area of about 1.4 to 2.2 size of Wales. That's about 7 to 11% of the sea area around UK. So you could Britain could go considerably nuclear, or it could use about 10% of the seas around the UK with some very big wind turbines dotted around. The picture shows a vertical axis machine floating, 10 megawatt, possibly 20 megawatt scale, and that's a British company that is designing that type of technology. If you were trying to do a solar PV comparison, it's very quickly becoming cost competitive. British innovations are upping the efficiency considerably, from say 14 to towards 20%, maybe in the next few years. So if you're covering most southern phasing roofs in the UK with these high efficiency cells, you could supply 50% of this 55 gigawatt nuclear programme. So that's half a nuclear If you put solar farms in the countryside, there may be some debate about that. You could add significantly to the supply from buildings. So that's the PV could be about the same as a 30 gigawatt deployment of small modular reactors. But in terms of net energy costs, this is where the DEC, Markal and other types of modelling is persuasive to those who want to be persuaded just by costs. And in DEC, in 2011, they said I think it would be 40 billion extra over the period to 2050 if you went non-nuclear compared with nuclear. So that's about 1 billion a year saving if you went pro-nuclear. But they weren't using the costs, the offshore wind costs that came out about 6 months earlier. So I'm not sure why they were not recalculating every week, considering the cost falls of offshore wind and PV. So I do question the cost models that DEC bring out. And then I would add the proliferation and foreign policy implications, because it's been set to zero. How do they cost that? They don't even want to bother trying to cost it. The possible mega terrorism events, uncosted. Uranium import dependency and security, again, uncosted. Public health risk, again. Intractable waste issues. British technology leads in jobs and exports. Additional armed services budget if you're trying to supply UK from Australia or whatever. And one could argue the visual impacts of a load of nuclear power stations on our coasts with a lot of offshore wind farms beginning to recede over certainly over the visible horizon offshore. As I say, onshore is probably done and dusted by about 2020-25, so the comparator is offshore wind. So one could argue that the visual impact, even the visual impacts, are probably less with offshore wind and PV. So those are some of the issues that I don't think Davy or the political parties have really considered. I don't think they're qualified to do that. I don't think they're particularly interested. And I do think they have a value that should be put in a model. So I would call for a re-justification. There is new and compelling evidence that of the balance and benefits and detriments. A significant escalation. It's not just what we had before. The system cost benefits are not significant in a nuclear scenario in all probability, if there's any at all. If the renewable costs come down as they are doing. There's no clear low carbon benefit. There's adverse security of uranium supply. Multiple GDFs, not one site found yet. And recent health evidence from Germany and presumably Fukushima will provide more evidence. So there's ample rationale to re-justify a major escalation in nuclear power. Call for public consultation. We've been led by the nose so far. In the Tory manifesto for the European elections coming up, they say a fundamental national duty of energy sovereignty and energy security. So the 2000 consultation was a replacement, then it's been going up and up and up. We were told it was going to be very low cost. I don't think it is. It was going to be 1 GDF and far less waste. I don't think that's true at all. It was going to be a balanced mix of different types of energy technology, if you remember that, balanced and mixed. And that was 5% of our energy. But it would then become 30 to 40% of our energy. And that would be most of our electricity. Most of our electricity would be coming from one source, nuclear power. Is that balanced or mixed? Hardly. And then the issues I've just been talking about, the wider issues of proliferation. How can we persuade Iran if we ourselves are building masses more of nuclear? vulnerability to terrorism. We've got British jihadists in Syria at the moment, you know, and we're on a heightened state of terrorist alert. We don't need nuclear power. They're very vulnerable. High dependency on uranium imports, I mentioned that before, and damage to British renewables and CCS technologies, jobs, export, and indeed our own indigenous energy. So no energy security. So that is my call for a re-justification and a reconsultation of nuclear power based on these ideas that the current programme is just a first tranche and we should expect more. Okay, thanks.